Welcome to the Victorian Brothel where secrets cost extra, reputations shatter, and the wallpaper's seen things no priest could forgive. Inside these gaslit walls, women sell smiles by the hour, pretend to love bad poetry, and dodge the occasional police raid. It's part theatre, part survival, and entirely more hygienic than you'd expect. So tighten your laces, sip something questionable, and prepare for a history lesson in heels. If you enjoy drifting off to sleep with tales of history's most scandalous professions, hit that like button and subscribe for more cozy chaos. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because it's oddly comforting to know we're all falling asleep to tales of powdered faces and emotional damage together. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and let yourself drift off to sleep as we step into a world of gaslight, gossip and wallpaper that's absolutely judging you. You're pretending to enjoy being fed grapes by a man who smells like mothballs and moral compromise. He calls himself the Duke, though you're fairly certain he once tried to pay with a button and a poem. He's shirtless, sweating profusely, and wearing only one sock, on his hand, which he occasionally uses to applaud himself. You're not sure if it's a kink or a budget puppet show. Either way, it's Tuesday. The room is hot. Not sexy hot. More like the upstairs of a poorly ventilated bakery, hot. You are, at present, being serenaded by a kazoo. He brought it with him, from home, said it helped him set the mood. And the mood, to be clear, is somewhere between parlour game gone wrong and Victorian gas leak hallucination. At one point he asks if he may kiss your elbow. You agree, mostly out of curiosity. He weeps, quietly. Says it reminded him of a girl named Hester, who once gave him a fruitcake and never returned his letters. You've never felt more like an elbow in your life. Eventually he collapses onto the settee, sighs dramatically and says, "I shall remember this night until the end of my days." You nod, take the coin, and remind him to collect his kazoo on the way out. Another satisfied customer. Or at least a thoroughly confused one. Either way, you've earned your supper. For Victorian sex workers, absurdity was often part of the job. While the modern imagination paints brothels as dens of wild debauchery or tragic ruin, the truth sat awkwardly in between, with plenty of uncomfortable silences, questionable hygiene, and clients who requested things that defied polite description. According to Henry Mayhew's 1851 London Labour and the London Poor, many clients hired women less for intercourse than for strange rituals, foot rubs, lullabies, readings from the newspaper, or simply the chance to be noticed. In one account from the 1870s, a brothel worker was paid to kneel on a rug and pretend to be a statue for 30 minutes while her client recited Latin love poems to a chair. Some clients were painfully shy, others were talkative in the worst possible way. One woman in Holborn reported in an 1889 Reformers interview that a man paid her threepence to sit in a chair and let him lecture her about the dangers of fluoride in drinking water. The encounter lasted 2 hours. She knitted a scarf, and yet these interactions could be more lucrative and less risky than the traditional assumptions about the trade. A quiet man with a fondness for elbow kissing and kazoo solos might be strange, but he wasn't violent. As the Morning Advertiser once put it in an 1863 brothel raid report, no two men sought the same comfort, nor offered it in equal coin. In many cases, these bizarre requests were tolerated, even preferred. They were safer than drunken brawlers or penny-pinching pickpockets, and if you had to endure kazoo foreplay in a velvet robe to get a hot meal, well, at least it made for a good story at breakfast. You're in the kitchen peeling potatoes, not because you enjoy it, no, you're still mentally recovering from the kazoo serenade, but because it's either this or listen to Violet reenact her client's squirrel impersonation from last night. Again. As you wrestle a particularly rebellious spud, you think about how you got here. It certainly wasn't your childhood dream. You didn't spend your girlhood sighing into lace curtains thinking, "One day, I shall be moderately paid to endure dramatic coughing fits and the occasional misplaced monocle." No, this path began the same way most do, with optimism, bad luck, and a landlord who didn't accept exhaustion and a compelling backstory as currency. There was a time you tried honest work, seamstress, laundress, selling matches in the street, all noble, all tragic, especially when your employer expected you to sew 800 buttonholes for a halfpenny, and the reward was scurvy. So when the woman in the red dress, the one who smelled like powdered sugar and secrets, asked if you'd like to make more than tuppence without bleeding out your thumbs, you listened. And here you are, potato-stained, elbow-kissed and financially solvent. Mostly. Victorian brothel workers came from every walk of life, and for many the path into sex work was paved by poverty, abandonment, or plain survival. Unlike the romanticised courtesans of French novels, most English sex workers were former domestic servants, factory girls, or widows who found themselves economically stranded, according to the 1857 report of the Royal Commission on the state of prostitution in London. The most common reason women gave for entering the trade was simple: hunger. A second was being turned out of doors, often after the death of a parent or the loss of employment. In short, sex work paid and other jobs did not. One woman, interviewed by Henry Mayhew, described earning 8 pence a day sewing underclothes, not enough to afford a room, let alone food. A friend introduced her to a brothel. Within a week she was eating warm meals and sleeping in a bed that didn't double as a storage crate. It wasn't always a dramatic fall. Sometimes it was an invitation. In 1881, a landlady testified in a police hearing that she'd recruited girls fresh from the country to her Soho house, with offers of light housework and good wages. The housework turned out to be optional. The good wages were real, if short-lived. Even advertisements in newspapers offered positions for young women that seemed respectable until one arrived at the address and realised it involved neither hats nor sewing machines. A notable case in the Illustrated Police News from 1876 detailed a woman hired as a dressmaker's assistant, only to discover she'd been listed in a gentleman's club registry before her second cup of tea. For many it was never truly a choice, it was the only door left open. You're sitting on a slightly sticky velvet settee, sipping tea that tastes suspiciously like yesterday's rinse water, and trying to look interested while Violet tells you, once again, about her toe ring collection. Across the parlour, 2 girls are arguing over a missing petticoat. Someone's curled up under the piano with a hangover, and the fire is doing its best impression of a dying moth. Ah, family. You didn't choose these women. They came with the furniture. But over time you've learned who snores, who steals soap, who sings Italian arias in the bath, and who once mistook a bishop for a chimney sweep and still got paid. There's Dolly, who speaks 4 languages and swears in 5. She once poured gin on a man's boots because he called her darling without paying first. Then there's Hetty, who claims she danced with a prince, though everyone suspects it was just a well-dressed waiter with confidence issues. And of course, Lily, who never takes clients over the age of 50, and says it's because old knees creak too loud. You eat together, drink together, argue over lace together, and occasionally hold each other's hair back when someone's supper reappears after a client with questionable cologne. This isn't friendship. It's something messier, stranger, stronger. It's the kind of sisterhood you only get from surviving corsets, clap, and conversations with men named Reginald who cry during foreplay. Brothel life in Victorian England created its own form of community, one built from shared trauma, mutual protection, and the occasional fight over a stolen hatpin. Women in these houses often formed intense bonds, shaped by the pressures of working, living, and surviving under one roof. The 1861 Sanitary Report on Metropolitan Vice noted that many brothel workers took ill not from the conditions of their profession, but from quarrels, overwork, or the jealousy of housemates. In other words, the danger wasn't just clients or the law, it was each other. But it was also each other who got you through it. There were hierarchies. New girls fetched the water. Older ones got the good wigs. In larger establishments, there might be a pecking order based on seniority, earnings, or who could fake an orgasm loud enough to scare off the constable next door. Still, most brothels operated like households, part dysfunctional family, part rotating cast of theatrical performers. In one 1872 letter from a former worker to the Social Purity Review, a woman described her time in a high-end house in Knightsbridge. We called ourselves the Velvet Vultures. We shared everything, clients, hairpieces, even the flu. No one ever stole a coin, but God help you if you use someone else's rouge. There was camaraderie, but also rivalry. In some houses, women were fined for being over-familiar with a client who belonged to someone else. In others, fines were handed out for leaving the chamber door open, overusing the good perfume, or eating jam directly from the jar. Despite the chaos, it was often safer than being on the street, and if a girl was sick, scorned, or just plain sad, chances were someone would pour her tea, brush her hair, and lend her the good corset. Because in the end, you were all in the same bodice-aching, coin-counting, kazoo-serenading business together. You're standing in front of a cracked mirror trying to decide which disaster to tackle first. The hair that's staging a coup, the corset that's threatening your internal organs, or the suspicious rash developing from that discount rouge Hetty swore was imported from Paris. It was not. It was definitely lard and crushed beetles. Your cheeks are blotchy, your hair smells like fireplace ash, and your one good stocking has migrated halfway down your shin like it's given up on this profession entirely. The only thing more exhausted than your body is your eyebrow pencil, which now resembles a haunted toothpick. Violet is behind you, trying to pluck a chin hair with the focus of a sniper, while Dolly wrestles with a pair of eyelash curlers that look like medieval dental instruments. Someone's yelling about missing face powder. Someone else is using gin as perfume. It's not even noon and you've already inhaled more arsenic-based powder than a miner in a coal shaft. And the corset. Oh, the corset. It takes 2 girls, a prayer, and 1 blunt hairbrush just to get the laces tight enough to achieve that prized wasp waist look. By the time they're done, you can't feel your ribs, but you do have cleavage sharp enough to slice cheese. Looking seductive has never felt so much like going into battle, but the war paint is on, the waist is cinched, and the gentleman callers are coming. God help them if your face melts mid-conversation. Victorian brothel workers were expected to maintain a level of visual perfection that bordered on theatrical, and occasionally fatal. The beauty routines of the time were as brutal as they were elaborate, especially for women whose livelihood depended on being seen as desirable, elegant, or just slightly less sweaty than the man paying them. Makeup was both essential and scandalous. Respectable women were expected to be naturally pale and modest, but sex workers wore heavy powder, rouge, and kohl, signs of their profession. Unfortunately, many of these products were packed with toxic substances like white lead, mercury, and arsenic. A popular face powder of the 1860s was marketed as Pearl Bloom, a delicate euphemism for facial poison. In an 1877 article from the Lady's Mirror, a physician warned against the use of face enamelling, a practice in which women applied a thick layer of white paste made from lead and vinegar to mask blemishes and even out skin tone. Over time, it caused ulcers, facial paralysis, and, in at least one recorded case, spontaneous nose collapse. Hair was another battlefield. Many brothel workers wore hairpieces, wigs, or added rats, bundled hair used for padding, to achieve fashionable volume. Curling irons, heated in open flames, frequently led to burns or accidental singeing. One brothel in Clerkenwell burned down entirely in 1869 after a girl left her iron in the fire too long and set her false fringe, and then the curtains, ablaze. And then there was the corset, the infamous wasp-waisted instrument of feminine refinement. A typical corset could reduce a waist to under 20 inches, displacing organs and making digestion, breathing, and upright walking a challenge. Doctors reported cases of fainting, cracked ribs, and in one alarming instance printed in the Lancet, a young woman's spleen was found partially collapsed after she passed out mid-courtship. But pain was part of the performance, beauty equaled value, and in a world where coin depended on first impressions, many women wore danger-like lipstick, layered on thick with a forced smile, and one eye always watching for the next better-paying client. You're trying to eat a boiled egg that smells faintly like betrayal. It wobbles suspiciously on your spoon as you stare down at the rest of your breakfast, a slice of toast that could legally be classified as a weapon, porridge with the texture of wallpaper paste, and something that might once have been a sausage before it gave up. Violet's already on her second helping. She claims it tastes better if you don't breathe while chewing. Across the table, Dolly is dissecting a herring like she's preparing it for surgery, and Lily is picking raisins out of her seed cake while making direct, unbroken eye contact with her tea. You don't ask questions anymore. The tea has its own ecosystem. The madam floats in, looking as if she hasn't eaten since the Crimean War but has very strong opinions about your posture. "Ladies," she says, "remember, no man will pay top coin for a girl with crumbs on her bodice." You look down. You are, in fact, one solid biscuit away from being a walking bakery display. Breakfast at the brothel is less a meal and more a ritual. Part survival, part social theatre, part early morning passive aggression served with marmalade. But it's warm, mostly edible, and better than whatever last night's client tried to call dinner, before sobbing into your décolletage about his fear of owls. You eat, you sip, you plan your next escape from herring duty. Life somehow continues. While Victorian brothel life was dangerous and demanding, Mealtimes were often one of the few moments of rest. Even if the food wasn't exactly Michelin-starred, meals varied dramatically depending on the class of brothel, the generosity of the madam, and whether the kitchen still had a functioning stove. In high-end houses, women might be served roast meats, pies, or puddings, especially when entertaining wealthy clients. In mid-tier or lower establishments, breakfast often consisted of porridge, bread, weak tea, and, when times were good, boiled eggs, kippers, or herring. According to an 1882 police inspection report of a Soho brothel, the girls were offered 3 meals daily, the largest being breakfast, and all included tea brewed at a strength best suited for cleaning coins. The Lancet Sanitary Report of 1864 described brothel kitchens as cramped, poorly ventilated, and decorated with grease to a Victorian standard. Many brothels operated on communal meals prepared in bulk, often by one of the girls herself. Roles rotated depending on illness, favouritism, or who lost a bet. Food was also used as leverage. In cheaper brothels, if a girl displeased the madam, by being late, sick, or refusing a client, she might find her plate noticeably empty or replaced with something unappetizing. A former worker writing under the pseudonym Maud described in an 1890 reform letter being punished with a week of dry toast and judgmental stares. Still, even bad food could be a bonding moment. In many brothels, girls shared jokes, gossip, or letters over stale seed cake. If the porridge was inedible, it was used as wool patch. If the tea had too much milk, it was sold to clients as special tonic. Everything had a second life, because when you lived by your wits and your waistline, even breakfast was a battleground worth surviving, preferably with toast hard enough to defend yourself. You're dusting a vase that hasn't held a flower since Queen Charlotte had teeth. Not because you care about interior decor. You're not trying to impress the clientele with your arrangement of cobwebs and ghost ferns, but because the madam has entered one of her inspection moods, which usually ends with someone getting screamed at for their lack of moral fortitude and their uneven dusting strokes. You suspect the vase is glued to the mantel, possibly out of spite. You wipe it anyway. Today is Parlour Perfection Thursday, which based on recent patterns means the madam is expecting a visit from the police, the priest, or someone else who might frown upon seeing a half-dressed lily chasing a rat with a shoe. Yesterday was Respectable Silence Wednesday, which meant no singing, swearing, or vocalized existential dread. Tomorrow is Client Charm Day, which sounds festive but mostly involves wearing a ribbon and pretending not to notice when someone asks if you do poetry. Your routine is chaos disguised as protocol. First, breakfast, survive. Then chores, like cleaning, heavy judgment. Then appointments scheduled loosely around the movements of a wall clock that runs 5 minutes late, and the digestive system of Dolly, who always eats pickled onions before seeing clients. The madam has posted new rules, again. No gentleman callers in the parlour unless accompanied by a chaperone or brandy. Do not rearrange the throw pillows, they are symbolic. No playing cards for favours unless madam is present to monitor cheating. Bodices must remain laced outside of work hours, except Sundays. The talking cat is not to be fed. You suspect at least 2 of those are inside jokes, but the others are very real. Especially the one about the cat. He's not yours. He simply arrived one day and never left, like most of the girls. You finish dusting the vase, still firmly glued, fluff the symbolic pillow, and prepare for the day ahead, which includes 2 appointments, 1 foot massage, a possible ghost sighting, and if you're lucky, 10 whole minutes of solitude in the upstairs lavatory before Hetty starts reciting Hamlet again. House rules were a fixture of brothel life in the Victorian era, even if those houses were barely more than glorified boarding rooms with wallpaper that peeled like sunburn. Every brothel had its own version, some formal, some spoken, some shouted through a door at 2 a.m. by a furious madam with curlers and a wooden spoon. These rules served a number of purposes. To keep peace among the girls, to present a veneer of civility for potential raids, and most importantly, to keep clients feeling like they were visiting something more refined than a hallway with stains. According to the 1857 Select Committee on Contagious Diseases Act's testimony, many brothels had housebooks or printed notices that outlined expectations for behaviour. Some instructed girls not to leave the premises without permission. Others outlined fines for lateness, poor hygiene, or being unladylike in front of clientele, a term that covered everything from eye-rolling to sarcasm. One surviving brothel rulebook from 1874, found in a police raid in Manchester, includes gems such as no spitting in the client's hat, even when provoked. Polish the brass daily, it reflects on the house. Silence during hymns on Sunday evenings is expected regardless of belief. There was often a strict schedule, not only for when girls worked, but when they ate, bathed, or rested. High-end houses operated more like businesses, shifts were assigned, client appointments booked in writing, and each girl kept an earnings ledger, which unsurprisingly many madams helped manage for a fee. Lower-end establishments were more informal, sometimes brutal, relying on whoever was conscious and not bleeding. Rules also enforced cleanliness, or what passed for it. Shared wash basins, a once-weekly linen boil, and a stern note on the mirror that read, "Rouge is for the face, not the furniture." Even medical visits were regulated. Girls were often required to submit to weekly examinations under the Contagious Diseases Acts, which many described as degrading and traumatic. Refusal meant fines or worse, expulsion. Despite the rigidity, many of these rules were fluid in practice. Some were more about control and order, and others were, frankly, absurd. In 1885, a brothel in Chelsea reportedly banned excessive eye contact with a client's dog, citing unsettling consequences. The rule remained posted for 6 years. Still, amidst the absurdity, rules brought structure. In a world where so little was in your control, your body, your clients, your future, there was some strange comfort in knowing that at least the brass would be polished, the biscuits rationed fairly, and the symbolic pillow would never, under any circumstances, be moved. It's inspection day, which is Victorian for prepare to be emotionally undressed by a man with cold hands and a superiority complex. You've had dental work less invasive than what's about to happen, and that was from a drunk on Fleet Street with a pair of pliers and a generous attitude toward anaesthesia. You're standing in line in your shift, staring at the back of Dolly's head, and wondering if her bun is slightly lopsided, or if you've developed vertigo from yesterday's corset incident. Lily is behind you, humming something haunting. It might be a lullaby, it might be a curse. Nobody asks. The doctor arrives wearing his usual outfit, coat too long, expression too judgmental, and moustache curled like it's plotting something. He nods, says, "Ladies," and begins the great poking ritual. You try to mentally escape, somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere that doesn't involve this man asking you to, "Please cough again," while looking vaguely disgusted by your entire existence. He makes notes. He tuts. He asks questions in a tone usually reserved for livestock. "Any discomfort?" he says. You consider saying, "Only every moment of my waking life," but you're trying to stay professional. When it's over, he scribbles something in his little book, waves you off like you're an unusually vocal pigeon, and moves on. You put your clothes back on, dignity somewhere near your ankles, and remind yourself that at least this week, there were no lectures about moral hygiene or feminine decay. Progress. Medical inspections in Victorian brothels weren't about health, they were about control. Under the Contagious Diseases Acts passed in the 1860s, women suspected of being prostitutes in certain towns and military districts could be forcibly subjected to internal medical examinations, often with no trial or formal accusation. The stated purpose was to curb the spread of venereal disease among British soldiers. The actual result was widespread trauma, humiliation, and legal abuses that disproportionately targeted poor women. These inspections were crude, degrading, and frequently performed with unsterilised instruments in unsanitary rooms. Women who refused were arrested, imprisoned, or sent to so-called lock hospitals for treatment, regardless of whether they were ill. A report in the British Medical Journal, 1870, noted that some women were examined with as little as 2 minutes of explanation, and no privacy, often while lined up in communal rooms. In her memoir, reformer Josephine Butler described the process as a form of state-sponsored assault, a degradation of the soul disguised as care of the body. She led a movement to repeal the acts, gaining support from politicians, clergy, and working women who viewed the system as unjust and misogynistic. By contrast, brothel madams often enforced their own inspection routines to avoid police raids or maintain reputation. In upscale houses, doctors were sometimes paid to certify girls as clean, though what constituted clean varied wildly. A former brothel physician, writing anonymously in an 1881 issue of The Lancet, admitted to examining upwards of 20 girls in a morning often in rooms with poor light and no wash basin. Records show that in some cases men would impersonate doctors to gain access to brothels under false pretenses, leading to incidents of abuse, theft, and in one bizarre case reported in the Manchester Guardian, unsolicited sermonising. The real cruelty of these examinations was not just their invasiveness, but their one-sidedness. Men who spread disease faced no penalty. Women who caught it were cast aside, as unclean, unfit, or, as one inspector phrased it, past market value. In the end, the Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed, but not before they left behind a legacy of shame and fear, stitched into the memory of every woman who had to brace herself for a knock on the door and the phrase "open wide" for Queen and Country. You've been sneezing for 3 days and your left eye has started twitching in a way that suggests it's considering independence. Your throat feels like you've swallowed gravel, your head is stuffed with cotton and betrayal, and your joints are making noises usually associated with haunted furniture. You'd love to lie down, really you would. But Hetty took the chaise with the least fleas, Violet is using the sofa for her dramatic faint practice, and the floorboards upstairs are busy being haunted. Again. So you sit hunched in a shawl that smells like old onions and regret, drinking lukewarm broth out of a chipped mug with the words "Don't ask" painted on the side, possibly in blood. Madam walks by, wrinkles her nose and says, "If you're going to cough, dear, at least try to do it attractively. You try, you fail. The other girls keep a generous 2-foot radius around you, not out of fear of contagion, but because no one wants to catch your sickly client list. Men who tip in buttons and bring you boiled sweets for your throat. You've officially been downgraded to coughing companion status, and still, you're expected to powder your nose, cinch the corset, and entertain Sir Sniffsalot in room 3, because as Madame so delicately put it, you're not dead yet, are you? Honestly, you're considering it. When a Victorian brothel worker got sick, the options range from try this tea and hope for the best, to crawl into a blanket and vanish. Most brothels had no real system for healthcare beyond isolation, denial, or prayer, usually depending on how profitable the sick woman was. In higher-end houses, some madams provided access to a doctor, but that service often came at a cost, either deducted from wages or added to the woman's growing debt. And that doctor was likely the same one who performed the weekly inspections, which meant limited bedside manner and an alarming tolerance for mercury. In cheaper brothels, illness was simply inconvenient. Workers who couldn't earn were quickly replaced or cast out. An 1879 article from the Daily Telegraph reported that one East End brothel expelled a girl for excessive sneezing, citing it as a nuisance to the clientele. There was no mention of where she went afterward. Common ailments included respiratory infections, thanks to the constant damp, digestive issues from questionable meals, and of course, venereal diseases. Treatments for syphilis often involved mercury rubs, vapour baths, or ingesting dangerous levels of iodine, which sometimes caused more damage than the illness itself. A report from The Lancet in 1865 recorded multiple cases of mercury poisoning in brothel populations, often leading to tremors, tooth loss, or death. In a letter preserved by the British Library, a former brothel worker wrote in 1883, "When I got the fever, I was made to stay in the attic. The other girls left bread on the stairs. I heard rats every night. When I was better, Madame said I owed her £3 for lost business." In some cases, other girls stepped in, sharing food, keeping company, and tending to one another in makeshift sick rooms. It wasn't policy, it was survival, a form of rough sisterhood in a system that saw them as expendable, and when someone didn't get better, she simply disappeared, taken to the workhouse infirmary, buried without name, or quietly replaced by a new face with clearer skin and a better cough. Because in the Victorian brothel you worked until you couldn't, and when you couldn't, well, that was someone else's problem. You're sitting at the edge of a canopy bed pretending to be someone's dead wife. Not just any dead wife, is dead wife Margaret. A woman whose defining characteristics, according to your client, were long-suffering, fond of lilacs, and quiet during dinner. You're wearing a borrowed nightgown, holding a slightly bruised daffodil, and nodding solemnly while he tearfully reads you his grocery list, as she would have wanted. You've been called worse. His name is Mr. Bramble. He smells like damp curtains and unresolved grief. He's paid triple the usual rate to sit beside you, hold your hand like he's auditioning for widowhood, and reminisce about the time Margaret burned a meat pie in 1849. You offer a gentle smile and a soft, "That does sound like her." He weeps. You reach for the hanky he brought, monogrammed and damp with anticipation. There is no touching, no undressing, no music. Just an hour of shared delusion, floral metaphors, and a brief moment where you're expected to hum a lullaby he insists Margaret sang to the curtains. You hum something. It works. As he leaves, he clasps your hand and whispers, "You brought her back to me." You nod, still in character. You're Margaret now. You're also exhausted, vaguely hungry, and suddenly allergic to lilacs. In the Victorian brothel, sex wasn't always the main product. Emotional labour, the act of pretending, listening, flattering, and fantasy building, was just as vital, and often more exhausting. Clients came not just for physical needs, but for companionship, control, conversation, and a peculiar kind of theatre. Some wanted to be dominated, others wanted to be soothed. Some wanted to confess sins, others just wanted someone to laugh at their jokes. In 1885, a reform pamphlet titled Truths from the Lower Room included testimonials from former clients who described paying women simply to talk, sing, or sit beside them while they ate. One man admitted he paid to play backgammon in silence while a girl read the Bible in Latin, which she absolutely did not speak. These encounters were, at times, heartbreakingly mundane. According to Henry Mayhew's interviews, many girls had regulars who treated them like wives or mistresses, bringing small gifts, sharing meals, or asking about their health. One brothel worker recounted a man who came weekly just to sit by the fire and have his boots shined while she asked him about his mother. It wasn't love, she said. It was loneliness that paid in coin. In high-end houses, roleplay was expected. Girls might pose as foreign nobility, long-lost loves, governesses, or in the particularly bizarre case reported in the Strand, a telepathic channel to Napoleon. For this, the client paid handsomely and brought a baguette as tribute. The emotional performance was a skill, and it was unpaid labour, invisible, exhausting, and rarely acknowledged. A woman might spend hours crafting an illusion for a man who had no interest in her reality. And if she failed, he might leave angry, or worse, leave nothing at all. But for the women inside, it wasn't just make-believe, it was business. You weren't just selling the body, you were selling a moment, a memory, a Margaret. And the better you were at pretending to care, the better your odds of eating tomorrow. You're outside, which is thrilling because it means fresh air, no clients, and a temporary break from the sound of Violet humming Greensleeves like it's a personal threat. You are dressed, conservatively. At least you're trying. The goal is to look like a governess, not a temptress. Unfortunately, the only coat available was last worn by someone twice your size and half your moral flexibility. You've cinched it with a curtain tie and topped it off with a bonnet that smells like expired lavender and defiance. You're walking down the street practicing your respectable lady face, brows slightly raised, lips pursed, like you're permanently judging the quality of someone's marmalade. You keep your eyes forward. You do not make eye contact. You absolutely do not wink at anyone, even if they wink first, even if they have nice teeth and a suspiciously full coin purse. You pass a clergyman. You nod. He nods. You feel victorious. And then you trip over a cabbage crate, shriek something highly unladylike, and land in a puddle with your skirt flipped halfway to Scotland. 3 street urchins applaud. A chimney sweep whistles. Somewhere, the madam's voice echoes in your head. That's why we don't go outside. You dust yourself off. You repurse your lips. You limp toward the grocer with the grace of a pigeon in boots. Because even in wet bloomers, dignity is a choice. In public, Victorian brothel workers had to become masters of disguise, blending in with respectable women to avoid harassment, arrest, or awkward encounters with clients' wives. It was illegal to solicit in the streets, but the definition of soliciting was vague and often enforced selectively. A woman walking alone, wearing rouge, or making prolonged eye contact with a man could be labelled a prostitute and arrested, even if she wasn't speaking. This led many sex workers to adopt the outward trappings of modesty. High collars, muted colours, serious expressions and gloves. Always gloves. As reported in an 1884 issue of the Police Gazette, one officer claimed to identify prostitutes by their strut. When questioned, he described the walk as overconfident. The public reaction to this statement was, predictably, laughter. Despite the risk, most brothel workers ventured out regularly, for food, fresh air, or a brief moment of pretending they belonged somewhere else. Some brothels even had walking shifts, allowing women to promenade through parks or markets in the hopes of attracting wealthier clients discreetly. In upscale districts like Mayfair or Bloomsbury, women wore borrowed respectability like a mask. In Soho or Clerkenwell, they blended into a larger crowd of maids, laundresses and performers, making it harder to distinguish who was selling what. An 1871 police file from Clerkenwell lists over 30 women arrested in 1 month on suspicion of immoral conduct, most of whom were released for lack of evidence or after paying a small bribe. For the women themselves, walking outside meant freedom, if temporary. It also meant danger. Pimps, jealous madams, or violent clients might follow. Curious reformers might question. Policemen might detain. A particularly eager journalist might ask probing questions while taking detailed notes about your hat. Still, they went out. Because outside you could be someone else, a governess, a widow, a tired woman looking for a quiet bench and a bread roll. And sometimes, just sometimes, that curtain-tied coat and judgmental marmalade face were enough to fool the world, if not yourself. You're currently engaged in hand-to-hand combat with your corset. It's winning. Dolly's behind you, yanking the laces like she's starting a lawnmower. You, meanwhile, are holding onto the bedpost and trying not to pass out or vomit, ideally neither. Tighter, Madam says, men don't pay for comfort. You consider asking if they pay for internal bleeding, but you can't get enough air for sarcasm. Next comes the rouge. You apply it generously and end up looking like a startled tomato. Powder? Everywhere. Your face, your hands, your teeth. You look like a haunted pastry. Hetty says it adds mystique. You say it adds asthma. You pull on your finest petticoat, which has survived 4 clients, a spilled glass of brandy, and that one time Lily's cat mistook it for a personal insult. Stockings, garters, bustle, bodice, layer after layer until you resemble an overstuffed sofa with opinions. You catch a glimpse of yourself in the mirror. You look radiant, or rabid. One of the two. Madam inspects everyone like a disapproving portrait. She adjusts a curl, straightens a ribbon, and then gives her blessing with a grunt. Showtime! And just like that, gaslights glowing, perfume applied, and your spine no longer where it used to be, you're ready to be irresistible to men who think a compliment is, "You smell better than my aunt." Evening preparation in Victorian brothels was less a makeover and more a full-scale theatrical production. The process involved hours of dressing, painting, scenting, and strategic discomfort, all to create an illusion of effortless beauty that no one actually enjoyed producing. Clothing was elaborate. Most brothel workers wore gowns that mimicked upper-class fashion, but with bolder colours and lower necklines. Fabrics were often second-hand, heavily mended, or bought on credit from seamstresses who catered specifically to ladies of the night. One woman interviewed in the Westminster Review in 1882 said she wore a borrowed dress that had outlived 3 other women. It had history, she noted, and holes. Corsets were mandatory, even if they turned your torso into a compressed accordion. Waist sizes of 18 to 22 inches were common, especially in higher-class houses where appearances were part of the price tag. In one case, documented in The Lancet, a young woman fainted mid-client after her corset snapped and struck her clavicle like a miniature crossbow. Makeup was simultaneously required and taboo. Respectable women avoided it. Brothel workers didn't have that luxury. They used powders made of lead or rice flour, rouge from carmine or crushed insects, and dark eye tints from soot and grease. One homemade eyeliner recipe included lamp-blackened pig fat stirred with a silver spoon under a waning moon. Whether it worked or summoned demons was unclear. Perfume was often used to disguise the scent of sweat, tobacco, gin, or despair. A popular scent called Mignonette's Bloom was rumoured to cause nosebleeds if applied too liberally. It was applied liberally. Everything about the evening transformation was a performance. You weren't just preparing your body, you were preparing your persona. The clever girl, the shy widow, the worldly muse. You created the fantasy your client paid for, even if it came with chafing, nausea, and a developing rash under your left armpit. Because in a business built on illusion, you were both actor and set piece, corseted, powdered, and priced to sell. You're eating soup in complete silence while the madam watches like she suspects one of you is planning treason. Is potato and leek, or turnip and regret? Hard to say. You sip it carefully, avoiding eye contact because the last girl who made a slurping sound was banished to 3 nights with Touchy Tony, a client who weeps if you interrupt his stories about wallpaper. The table is set with mismatched cutlery, one communal butter knife, and a gravy boat that looks like it's seen some things. Violet's trying to make conversation about corset rash remedies, but Madame holds up one liver-spotted finger and says, "Ladies, we do not discuss chafing while chewing." Everyone falls quiet again. Madame eats like a queen who's recently won a land dispute. Small bites, long chews, eyes scanning the room like a falcon at a confession booth. She's wearing her evening jewellery, which includes a brooch shaped like a scorpion and earrings that may or may not be loaded. Dolly attempts a toast. "To survival," she says, raising her teacup. Madame does not raise hers. She simply mutters, "Let's hope," and continues cutting her meat with the precision of a tax auditor. No one else tries a toast after that. You eat what's put in front of you. You compliment the soup. You do not mention that it tastes like boiled towel. You just sit, chew, and pray that Hetty doesn't bring up politics again. Last time she did, Madame quoted a 12-minute passage from the Iliad and nobody got dessert. In Victorian brothels, the Madame was both monarch and jailer, commanding respect, doling out punishment, and in some cases offering genuine protection to the women in her employ. Meals shared with the Madame were less about nourishment and more about etiquette, control, and quietly enforced loyalty. In larger or more successful houses, communal meals were often a formal affair. Girls were expected to be clean, dressed properly, and well-mannered, not only to maintain appearances, but to remind them who was in charge. As noted in the 1876 Clerkenwell court proceedings, one madam fined a girl 6pence for using slang during soup. Madams varied wildly in temperament. Some were former workers themselves and treated the girls with a maternal, if hard-edged, kind of care. Others were shrewd businesswomen who saw their house like a finely tuned machine, where emotional attachments only got in the way of profit margins. A notable madam in Soho, mentioned in an 1880 police ledger, enforced mealtime recitations, where girls had to quote poetry before being served pudding. It was considered a bonding exercise. Most considered it a hostage situation. Power dynamics were always present. The madam controlled room assignments, schedules, punishment, protection, and sometimes even clothing. Mealtimes gave her a chance to reinforce those roles. A kind word for the top earner, a cold shoulder for the girl who'd been sick, a public scolding for someone who borrowed perfume without asking. But meals could also be a strange respite. They were one of the few moments when everyone, including the madam, sat, ate, and existed as something resembling a household. There was gossip, there were inside jokes, and occasionally there was laughter. The real kind, not the kind you practice in the mirror for rich men. Still, you never forgot who was at the head of the table, because in the Victorian brothel power always wore pearls, and could withhold pudding at will. The gas lights are flickering, the parlour rug has been beaten into something resembling fluff, and Dolly is already perched on the piano bench like she's expecting to be painted. It's evening. Showtime. You've powdered, plucked and perspired for this very moment, and now your job is to be alluring, attentive, and preferably not sneeze into anyone's sherry. The bell rings. A client arrives. You're up first. Naturally. Madam smiles at you the way a cat smiles at a canary it's not quite hungry for. She gives you that dreadful introduction she always uses. This one's clever, but not too clever, and disappears with the grace of a woman who once outran a constable in heels. Tonight's gentleman is fine, in the way that an unseasoned potato is fine. His hair is thinning, his cravat is aggressively floral, and he insists on being called captain, despite lacking any discernible boat. He talks for 20 minutes about the finer points of chimney design. You listen, you nod. You resist the urge to bite the embroidery off a pillow just to feel something. When he finally gets to the point, "May I remove my socks?" You smile sweetly and say, "Only if they behave themselves." He laughs. You laugh. The socks do not behave. An hour later, he leaves with a lighter wallet and a look of misplaced satisfaction. You reapply your lipstick and whisper a prayer to St. Patience, because next up is the Earl who likes to be called Muffin, and ask about your thoughts on train schedules. Evening in a Victorian brothel was when the real business began, a carefully managed operation full of gaslight, glamour, and gallows humour. As darkness fell, women assumed personas, madams became hostesses, and the entire house transformed into a marketplace of fantasy and negotiation. Clients arrived in a variety of states, sober, drunk, confused, remorseful, and were met with a blend of charm and strategic performance. Brothels often had parlour rooms set up like salons or tea rooms, complete with pianofortes, lace curtains, and reading material no one ever read. Women were introduced one by one, or in groups, depending on the client's preferences and the madam's mood. According to the 1873 report of the London Vice Committee, mid to high-tier houses often employed a sort of rotating seduction, where girls took turns making conversation until a client made a selection. In one Soho brothel, clients were given calling cards with names like Miss Ruby or the Countess to choose from, much like ordering dessert. Pricing varied, some houses charged a flat rate, others left it to the girls to negotiate and defend. Tips were common. So were IOs us. And on more than one occasion, women were paid in goods, a chicken, a silver spoon, or once, as noted in the Illustrated Police News, a crate of novelty cufflinks shaped like famous politicians. Not all encounters were sexual. Some men paid for conversation, for confession, for songs played badly on the harp. One woman reported earning 5 shillings from a client who wanted to be read a Christmas carol in an angry tone. Another was paid to gently insult a man's choice in wallpaper for 45 uninterrupted minutes, but the risk never disappeared. Clients could be sweet or cruel, rich or stingy, quiet or loud, and sometimes all within the same hour. Women learned to read moods like weather, to keep one foot ready for the door and to maintain charm even when their corsets pinched and their feet ached and someone was humming Greensleeves off key in the next room. Because once the lamps were lit and the bell rang, the brothel became a stage, and everyone, you, the madam, the girls, and even the man in the novelty socks, had a part to play. You're sitting across from a man who has just asked if you believe in ghosts, not metaphorically, literally. He leans in, eyes wide, and says, "Margaret says you seem trustworthy." You glance around the room. There is no Margaret, at least not visibly. But you've dealt with men who've asked stranger things. One fellow once paid you to slap him with a baguette and call him Commodore. So you nod. "I believe," you say, especially in the ones who talk about you behind your back. He beams. He's delighted. Apparently Margaret was his third wife, or possibly his piano teacher, and she's been whispering messages since he accidentally sat on a séance table in 1872. You are now officially his emotional medium, and he has questions, many of them. You spend the next hour navigating his grief, his guilt, and a very detailed story about a haunted chamber pot. You hold his hand. You assure him that Margaret forgives his peculiar interest in beetroot. He cries softly. You pass him a handkerchief that may or may not have been used earlier on a sausage roll. At the end, he thanks you with the sincerity of a man who's just returned from war. "You're the only one who listens," he says. You smile, you nod. You guide him to the door, gently reminding him to take his coat, his hat, and his imaginary spouse. And then you sit down, remove your shoes, and whisper, "Margaret, if you're listening, next time, send someone with snacks." While many imagine Victorian brothel visits as purely transactional, the reality was often far stranger and far more emotionally complicated. Regular clients, also known as protectors or sweethearts, frequently developed long-term attachments to the women they saw, creating bonds that were part fantasy, part comfort, and occasionally quite genuine. According to the 1882 Journal of Urban Life and Vice, an estimated 1/3 of working women in London brothels had one or more steady patrons, men who returned weekly or monthly, not only for sex but for company. These men often brought gifts, paid extra for exclusive access, or simply wanted someone to listen while they unravelled emotionally in a room that smelled like perfume and old velvet. A notable case in an 1879 edition of The Times described a banker who visited the same brothel for over 5 years, insisting that Miss Clara was the only person who truly understood him. Upon his death, she received a modest inheritance and a handwritten note thanking her for keeping my loneliness from devouring me. Clara reportedly used the money to open a boarding house and never spoke of him again. Not all relationships were romantic. Some were odd. In Soho, one madam recounted a client who visited weekly to sit in a chair while a girl told him bedtime stories. In Whitechapel, a former maid was paid to mimic the client's childhood nanny, complete with stern glances and lectures about posture. But emotional attachment was a double-edged sword. Women were expected to maintain the illusion of interest, to laugh at jokes, remember details, feign affection. Too little warmth, and a client might disappear. Too much, and he might become possessive or violent. As one girl told a reformer in 1884, "He brought me oranges and poems. Then he asked if I loved him. I said yes. He didn't come back." Still, the emotional labour persisted, not because it was easy, but because it paid, in coin, in gifts, in slightly better dinners, or sometimes just in a conversation that didn't involve foot fetishes or kazoo solos, because in a world where you sold fantasy, sometimes pretending to care meant someone else could believe they were loved, if only for an hour. Someone shouts "police," and suddenly it's all corsets, candles, and chaos. You're mid-sentence. Something about moonlight and the Duke of Northumberland's toenail collection. When the back door slams, a tea tray flies, and Hetty vanishes behind a curtain like a magician fleeing tax fraud. Dolly throws herself into a wardrobe. Violet tries to hide behind a fern. A very large, very naked client attempts to climb out the pantry window and gets stuck halfway. You consider helping him, but he's wearing nothing but socks and a monocle, and frankly, you've got your own problems. The madam barks orders like a general at war. "Hide the ledgers, light the incense, somebody sit on the brandy stains." You grab a shawl, a biscuit, and a pair of gloves that definitely aren't yours, then rush to the front room and attempt to become one with the upholstery. Two constables burst in looking simultaneously triumphant and deeply uncomfortable. One trips over the dog, the other sneezes violently and accuses the wallpaper of being too suggestive. You adopt your best governess expression. You're definitely not a sex worker. You're an innocent woman visiting your aunt, who's not here right now because she's very religious and temporarily in the cellar. The policemen begin poking around, asking questions, muttering about morality and disorderly conduct. The naked man in the pantry yells, "I have rights," and sneezes. One of the girls fakes a faint. You applaud internally. By the time they leave, red-faced, empty-handed, and suspiciously sticky from the brandy floor, the house is a mess. 2 wigs are missing, and someone has eaten your emergency shortbread. Standard Tuesday. Police raids on brothels were frequent, theatrical, and often motivated more by public image than actual law enforcement. Victorian society loved a moral panic, and brothels made convenient targets, especially when the newspapers needed a scandal and politicians needed a distraction. Under laws like the Disorderly Houses Act and Vagrancy Act, brothel raids could be launched on the flimsiest of grounds. A suspicious address, a complaint from a neighbour, or even the noise of laughter through a closed window could trigger a bust. Sometimes police were tipped off by angry clients. Other times, raids were scheduled around social events, timed to appear vigilant. According to the 1883 London Metropolitan Police Report, 217 brothel raids were conducted that year in London alone. Most resulted in fines, short imprisonments, or the brief closure of the house. But the real damage was reputational. A woman named in court or in the papers could lose everything: her safety, her client base, even her housing. Raids were often announced with little warning. Girls would scatter. Evidence was hidden, or eaten if necessary. Ledgers were burned, names crossed out, and anyone not essential was turned into a cousin visiting from the countryside. In one case reported by the Pall Mall Gazette, a brothel disguised itself as a hat shop during a raid, with clients frantically trying on bonnets, while police interviewed a saleswoman holding a whip. Bribery was common. Some madams paid regular fees to local authorities for protection. Others maintained relationships with certain constables who would tip them off in advance. A 1879th journal entry from a Soho madam reads, "Inspector L came by again, took tea and 4 shillings, promised no visits this week unless something explodes." But not all raids were clean. Women were assaulted, beaten or extorted. Records from the Contagious Diseases Act Commission include testimony from workers who were threatened with arrest unless they provided services to the arresting officers. Some were charged even if no client was present, simply for living in a house labelled immoral. Still, the show went on, because in Victorian London morality was often enforced with boots and billy clubs, and survival meant knowing how to smile while the wallpaper peeled and the naked man in the pantry sang the national anthem. You're not sure yet, but you have a suspicion. You've been craving vinegar, crying during chimney advertisements, and your corset no longer closes without divine intervention, and a team of strong-willed women. You dropped a biscuit this morning and burst into tears. It's either pregnancy, or you've finally cracked under the pressure of last week's kazoo duet. You haven't told anyone, not even Dolly, who claims she can smell babies from 6 blocks away. Instead, you've taken to walking slowly, breathing strategically, and avoiding the madam, whose sensitivity toward reproductive issues is on par with a wet broom. At dinner, someone jokes about fat ankles and you nearly launch a spoon across the room. Violet offers you her pickled onions in solidarity. You accept them with the gravitas of a woman accepting her fate. Lily leans in and whispers, "So, have you picked a name yet? Or are we going with client number 4? You smile, you laugh. You make a quiet promise to the possible human currently rearranging your spleen that if you survive this place, they will never eat pickled onions again. Pregnancy among brothel workers in the Victorian era was common, complicated, and deeply stigmatized. In an environment where contraception was unreliable and clients were often unwilling, the risk of becoming pregnant hovered constantly in the background of every transaction. Contraceptive methods of the time range from the laughably ineffective, jumping up and down after intercourse, to the moderately hopeful, sponge, soaked in vinegar, animal intestine sheaths, and womb veils. Most clients refused them. Some even paid extra not to use them, and the burden of consequence, as always, fell entirely on the woman. When a brothel worker became pregnant, her fate varied wildly depending on the house, the madam, and her own ingenuity. Some madams allowed women to work until they began to show, then quietly replaced them. Others immediately dismissed them, either out of cruelty, financial logic, or fear of attracting unwanted attention. A police report from 1878 details the case of a young woman found ill and bleeding in an alley after being ejected by her house for improper swelling. Another case from 1882 recounts a brothel in Camden where the madam arranged for a midwife to remove the problem in exchange for continued loyalty and a reduced debt. A euphemism for backroom abortion that was both illegal and dangerous. There were few options. Workhouses were reluctant to accept fallen women, especially those who had conceived out of wedlock and worked in vice. Charity homes like the Magdalen Asylum for penitent females offered housing, but only under strict moral conditions, often requiring total renunciation of sex work, isolation from their children, and public confession. Some women kept working as long as they could. A few found clients who were surprisingly supportive, even offering financial help or pretending paternity. But most hid their pregnancies until it became impossible, relying on other women in the house for help, secrecy, and second-hand baby clothes. And when the child was born, it was either raised in secret, handed to a relative, placed in a foundling home, or not mentioned again. A diary entry from a brothel worker in 1889 reads, "I had a daughter. No one speaks of her now, but I remember the night I first felt her kick, while a man was talking to me about cheese. It was the only real thing in the room. In a world that bought bodies but ignored consequences, pregnancy was a risk carried quietly, between powdered lips, behind closed doors, and beneath layers of silk and survival. You're staring out the parlour window like a heroine in a tragic romance novel. If that heroine were barefoot wearing last night's lipstick and using a fork to remove a hairpin from her bun. Outside, respectable women bustle by with shopping baskets and judgmental bonnets. One of them pauses to glare directly at you. You wave, she gasps, you blow a kiss, she trips over a cabbage. You sigh dramatically because it's your weekly dream of escape moment. Every girl gets one. You imagine a cottage in the country, chickens, apron, husband who doesn't cry during socks removal, maybe a small shop selling something wholesome, like jams or aggressively plain embroidery. You fantasize about quiet mornings, sensible shoes, and tea that isn't laced with gin or other people's secrets. Of course, Dolly dreams of Paris. Violet wants to run a boarding house for widows with sharp opinions. Hetty insists she'll marry rich and write scandalous novels under a false name. Everyone has a plan. Everyone has a maybe. You? You haven't figured out the how yet, or the when, but the why is very clear. Because sometimes pretending is no longer enough. Because you've learned the art of the slow sigh and the patient smile. And because one day you might want to be someone real, even if just for an afternoon. For many Victorian brothel workers, the dream of escape was a constant, whispered over late-night tea, scribbled in hidden notebooks, or spoken softly to sympathetic clients. The realities of sex work were harsh, but the human desire for change, for a different life, never vanished. Some women hoped to marry out. If a regular client became infatuated enough, he might offer to take her away, though this rarely ended well. In most cases, these relationships collapsed under public pressure, family disapproval or financial instability. An 1872 report in the Morning Advertiser details a young man who eloped with a brothel worker, only to be disinherited, publicly shamed and arrested for improper cohabitation. Others tried to start over, with savings, if they had any, a few open tea shops, dressmaking businesses, or moved to smaller towns where their past was unknown. Charity organisations like the Female Mission to the Fallen offered redemption housing, though these programs came with strict rules: no visitors, no alcohol, mandatory prayer, and long hours of moral instruction. Some succeeded, many left. There were also those who disappeared intentionally, changed names, invented backstories. One reformer, writing in 1886, claimed she met 3 seamstresses in 1 week, who all used to work the Strand and had independently chosen to become invisible. But for every escape there were dozens who stayed, not because they lacked dreams, but because they lacked the luxury of pursuing them. Debt, addiction, illness, or sheer exhaustion kept them anchored. Still, the dream persisted, because sometimes it wasn't about actually leaving. It was about believing you could, about looking out a window and thinking, I could be someone else, about planning the shop, naming the chickens, designing the embroidery patterns. In a world where your name changed with each client, dreaming of escape was an act of rebellion. It was hope, folded between corset hooks and powdered cheeks. It was your maybe, your someday, your secret story, written just for you. It's late, the gas lights are out, the fire's down to glowing coals, and someone, probably Lily, is snoring like she's training for a competition. The house is quiet except for the floorboard that always creaks at 2:17 and the faint rustle of dreams trying to escape through the wallpaper. You're still awake. The corset is off. The rouge is gone. The person you play all night long, the flirt, the muse, the shoulder to cry on, has been carefully folded and put away for morning. What's left is just you, bones aching, feet sore, soul flickering like the last of the lamp oil. You wonder how many girls have sat in this very spot thinking the same thing. Will I do this forever? Will anyone remember my real name? You think about the ones who left, the ones who vanished, and the ones who didn't make it through the winter. And then you yawn, because even deep thoughts need sleep. You wrap yourself in a borrowed blanket, rest your head against a lumpy cushion that smells like old perfume and toast, and let your eyes close, just for a moment. Somewhere in the corner of your heart the dream still lives. The Victorian brothel didn't come with a retirement plan. For most women, aging out of sex work wasn't an event. It was a slow erosion. Fewer clients, less income, fading beauty, fading health, and eventually fading options. Some moved into domestic service or became housekeepers in the very brothels where they once worked. Others transitioned into street work, charging less for more danger. A few found benefactors or husbands, most did not. There were no records for most, no obituaries, just brief mentions in court papers, reform pamphlets, or the memory of someone who once shared a room, a joke, a secret. A report from the Metropolitan Social Purity League, 1890, estimated that nearly 60% of brothel women disappear from record within 5 years of first entry. Some died, some moved, some simply faded into history without so much as a full name, and yet they were everywhere, behind lace curtains, in hidden rooms above shops, waiting on stairs, standing in windows. They were the shadows in the gaslight, the laugh behind the parlour door, the whisper at the pub. They survived in a world that punished them for doing so. They held each other up, told stories no one wrote down, and navigated love, loss, and wallpaper with supernatural strength. Many dreamed of something better. Some made it, others didn't. But every night, behind closed doors, they transformed themselves into someone worth remembering, whether the world did or not. And maybe that, in the end, is its own kind of legacy. And now, as the last gaslight dims and the parlour settles beneath moonlight and memory, I hope this strange walk through Victorian velvet, vice and very questionable wallpaper lingers, like the scent of cheap perfume on lace, or the echo of a client sobbing into his own cravat. You've braved collapsing corsets, haunted curtains, emotional labour with a side of soup, and scandal served nightly with tea. But now it's time to rest. The heels have stopped clicking, the whispers have faded, and for tonight the brothel is quiet. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived another evening inside history's most scandalously underpaid performance. Hit subscribe so we can sneak back into another strange corner of the past tomorrow night. And as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will carry you deeper, far from powdered faces and perfume-laced lies, and into sleep.